ado, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Anne Malletz from the University of Reading, and who's going to talk to us under this enigmatic and wonderfully mellifluous title, Spheres, Rays and Superluminary Airs.
Thank you. I should start by saying, well, first of all, thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation to speak. I should also explain that I am not a scientist, I am one of the medieval humanities specialists, and my particular interest is in what might loosely be called the meeting point between science and what was considered to be magic in the medieval period. And I am particularly here this afternoon to talk about part of a research project which I've been working on for a couple of years now, which has to do with the understanding of weather and the extent to which changes in the weather in the future could be predicted, as understood in the medieval period. And that's why I went for this very grand but very vague title, because weather brought together all sorts of problems which were both theologically and practically and scientifically difficult in the society which we are focusing on. And it is also something on which Grosseteste himself made a very important and distinctive intervention. So why was weather a problem for medieval thinkers? Because it raised all sorts of problems about the relationship, first of all, between God and the natural and human world. It was clear from the reading of the Bible that God used extreme weather events both to send messages to human society and to reward or to punish. And that the interpretation of weather events and the interpretation of God's warnings of future weather events was a very important matter in the Bible. If you think of examples of prophets from the Old Testament, the kings are given warnings about forthcoming events through dreams, which then have to be interpreted by a true prophet before their correct meaning can be understood. Then, once Joseph has made his interpretation, Pharaoh knows to allow for the coming years of famine, and society can be saved, and so on. So in the early Middle Ages, I am summarising wildly, so feel free to ask questions at the end, but in the early medieval period, it was assumed that weather was something that humans were simply given. God sends it. Extreme weather is also sent by God, and to all intents and purposes, it is beyond human understanding. Now then comes, again simplifying wildly, the 12th century and the arrival of Greek and Arabic science, and the sudden revelation that it is possible to see weather in a completely different way. This is to show you the impact of the new science. I'm sorry that this is not clear, but by the 13th century, an enormous amount of new data about planetary positions, the positions of stars and star formations, and how these movements of the heavens related to events on Earth had become available. So suddenly weather is not a means of communication between God and human society, but a predictable part, or a potentially predictable part, of the natural world. And weather becomes a function of time and place, which is what makes it relevant for this afternoon's session on time and its calculation. What I mean by that is that in the new understanding of the world, weather ought simply to be produced by your place on the globe, and therefore the climatic zone in which you live, and the time of year which dominates or produces the relationship between the sun and the moon, the two key planets, and your particular place. So this ought to be a simple, predictable matter. And yet, extreme weather events can happen in almost any time of year, in almost any point on the globe. And equally, even if you take just one place and focus, say, on 1 month, you will find that the weather in that place, in that month, varies year by year. So what is going on? And how predictable is it? And when does unpredictable weather become a sign from God? This is a problem for theologians, it's a problem for historians, for chroniclers, who have to decide how to record a weather event. At what point a weather event becomes extreme enough to be written down in their chronicle as something of major significance. And interpretation is still seen as a matter for the inspired. It verges almost on prophecy. Now we come to the 13th century, and the further layer of complication, which this slide, and particularly the upper image of this in this slide, is meant to represent. Because the idea of a machina mundi, or the world machine, becomes even more sophisticated and apparently even more predictable. If weather is a function of the movements of the sun, the movements of the moon, and the movements of the other planets within the complex set of rings which make up the machine of the universe, why is weather still so variable? Well, the increasing answer was because it's not a simple matter. Weather is the result of the interactions of all of these planets. And the more that was understood about the orbits of the planets and the complexity of the orbits of the planets as they move around their sphere, so it was understood that the same point on the globe at the same time in any year can be underneath a different interacting set of planets. And this made a beautifully logical explanation for changes in weather year on year. Now, if that was accepted, and it was, the next question is, well, does this mean that weather is simply predictable? If we can figure out the exact configuration of planets in relation to a particular point on the globe on any date we want, can we deduce from that exactly what the weather will be? Or is this, in effect, trespassing into the forbidden territory of what was called judicial astrology, which had been roundly condemned by Augustine back in the 5th century, and which all theologians routinely condemned? The problem with judicial astrology is that it makes predictions about human beings. And as Augustine had already pointed out, and as all theologians repeated after him, to say that the planets can predict what a human being will do is seriously to trespass on that human being's free will. And if you take away free will, you take away moral responsibility, and almost the whole of Christian theology and moral thinking comes crashing down. So judicial astrology is completely flying in the face of acceptable doctrine. So it seems simple. Judicial astrology is out because it predicts actions that human beings supposedly will make in the future, or things that will happen to human beings in the future. But reading the natural universe, reading the natural world, is merely science. It's not judicial astrology at all, it's just making a scientific prediction. Now this is where our next problem comes in. Grosseteste himself was perfectly happy about that distinction. But the next problem is, was it possible for astronomers and astrologers in this period to calculate the coming positions of the planets with sufficient accuracy? And that's partly what's going on in this image, because one of the complications precisely had to do with the three-dimensional relationships between the movements and positions of the planets, and the degree of complexity with which an astronomer or an astrologer was trying to predict the positions of those planets. And one reason why I chose this image, which is from a manuscript which contains works by Grosseteste but does not depict, I have to confess, Grosseteste himself, is the philosopher at the top, the large brown-looking object which the figure at the top is holding, is an armillary sphere, within which you have a simplified three-dimensional model of the orbits around which the planets move. Down at the bottom, you have a two-dimensional representation of the concentric spheres, which delimit the zones within which the orbit of each planet is set, and the outer zone of the fixed stars, which effectively controls them all, and within which the belt of the zodiac and the signs of the zodiac, which is going to be very important for all of this, is set. Already, though, you see that in order to understand the actual layout of the spheres, we have to move to a two-dimensional diagram and away from three dimensions. And this is part of the problem that Grosseteste himself identified. So if I come on to him, one of the problems with Grosseteste is, did he distinguish between astrology and astronomy? Where did he think the boundary between the acceptable and the unacceptable was? And what has weather forecasting got to do with all of this? Well, it is said often that Grosseteste, early in his writing career, was interested in astrology. And part of the evidence for this comes from a manuscript in the Bodleian Library, which is now Saville 21, which contains what are usually called astrological diagrams. But they are simply diagrams of two conjunctions, two planetary conjunctions, which took place in the year 1215 to 16. Now, the manuscript itself contains a lot of mathematical information. It also contains tables for a Latin person who wants to try to understand the Arabic calendar. And it contains data on making calculations. Why is the Arabic calendar important for someone who wants to make a reading of where the planets are? Because the tables, which gave basic positions for the planets, from which all of your calculations are going to be made, were originally produced, well, in the version that comes into Latin and into Western Europe, were produced according to an Arabic calendar. And if you want to try to use them accurately, you therefore have to deal with the Arabic calendar as well as with all of the other problems. Why is this relevant? Because Grosseteste annotated the two diagrams of conjunctions, or it is said that this is his handwriting. And if it is, I have to tell you that in 1215 to 16, Grosseteste was not very expert at understanding the Arabic calendar, and also there is something severely wrong with the calculations involved, because the two conjunctions both involve the planet Saturn. They're in 2 consecutive months, probably in the same year, though the annotation is awkward and it's not clear. And they have the planet Saturn at a distance apart of only 1 month in 2 different signs of the zodiac. And that is not possible at the points of the zodiac given in these calculations, because Saturn moves far too slowly. So something has gone horribly wrong for whoever made those calculations. Now, if we skip forward to Grosseteste's commentary on the hexameron, the days of creation, and the section where he's talking about the creation of the planets and what it is legitimate and illegitimate to read from the planets, you find that he goes out of his way to say that weather forecasting from the planets is fine, but that judicial astrology is wrong. He repeats Augustine's arguments as to why judicial astrology is wrong, and then comes an outburst in which he says, and anyway, the astronomers just cannot do it. They cannot know exactly where the planets are going to be. They need to know the positions, they need to know the qualities of the signs, they need to know the powers of the planets, they need to know the risings, they need to know the aspects, they need to know the divisions of the signs. It just is not possible. And therefore, the whole thing is rubbish, because the astronomers just cannot make these predictions effectively. And this is known to anyone who has worked hard on the tables and on the Arabic calendar. So I don't think this is a condemnation of all uses of astronomy or astrology to predict the future at all. I think it has to do, in relation to the weather with the sheer practical difficulty of it. And that's what makes what may be the late treatise, which I have recently been working on, so interesting. So this is simply from a published version of a different text, but it's my evidence that certainly by the time that the treatise on the impressions of the air, and therefore on weather forecasting, was written, Grosseteste had been doing a lot of work on planetary tables and on spherical geometry. And I am now much happier than I used to be about the idea that this treatise was actually written in the 1240s, and that Grosseteste therefore has come back to weather forecasting, now not only believing that it is potentially possible, but actually arguing that it is genuinely, practically possible. The treatise is in 3 parts. The first part is effectively a simplification and abbreviation of Book 1 of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. So we're taken at rapid speed and in simplified version through the planets, the signs, the combination of qualities of each planet and each sign, and the element to which each sign relates. He then introduces the technical term triplicity, then takes you through very briefly the portions of life on Earth to which each planet is particularly attuned, and then comes up with what seems to be entirely his own system. He takes from Ptolemy the idea that the planets are particularly powerful when they are in harmony with one another, and therefore in certain designated aspects in relation to one another. And he actually quantifies these. He arranges them. One is 5 times more powerful than the least, one is 4, 3, 2, and so on. I won't take you through all the detailed terminology because you would fall asleep. But this has been seen by historians as very reductive and mechanistic, and as Grosseteste oversimplifying to an almost comic level. That is unfair, for a start, because he introduces at this point the idea that you are looking to find which planet has the most power at any particular point. Because that one, he says, is going to be the dispositor ilius temporis, so the lord of the hour or of the time. And what he's given you is a mathematical, scientific way of making that calculation. The middle point of the treatise then goes into the spherical geometry, which is illustrated by this image. Because here Grosseteste has yet another completely individual and unique argument to make, and almost going against the system set out in Ptolemy's Almagest, which I think possibly he didn't know when he was writing this treatise. Because he wants to argue that the planet, any planet, is particularly powerful when it's at the apogee, or O, of its orbit, and less powerful when it is at the lower point, or perigee, of its orbit. And he has a scientific proof for this. Simplifying radically, what he says is that a planet at the furthest point of its orbit will be moving on a circle whose radius is considerably greater than the equivalent circle whose radius is the smaller part of the diameter of the eccentric circle overall. That probably doesn't make much sense, but effectively the planet has got to travel further around the sky when at O than when at opposite O. His next step is to point out that the revolutions of the firmament, which are governing all of this, are constant and take place at the same speed every day. And the length of time during which the planet is at apogee or perigee will be the same. Therefore, if the planet has got to cover more distance in the same time, it must necessarily be moving faster, and hence it will be more powerful. Now, he takes you through some incredibly complicated spherical geometry to prove this, which I cannot follow. All I can say is that his references to Theodosius' Spherics are accurate, and insofar as I can follow the arguments, he does seem to know what he was talking about. So he has now made 2 completely original interventions into the science of the planets, all in the course of predicting the weather. And the final part of the treatise is to make predictions for the year 1249. The first of them for April 1249, which identifies the sun as the dispositor of the time, or lord of the time, and explains why the contrary positions of Venus and the moon are not to be seen as too negative. And this is followed by a little note that says, and so it turned out. Then he goes on to another forecast, this one for July 1249, which is not followed by any such note. Now, if the note is part of a working version of this text, that dates these predictions to the middle of 1249 pretty precisely. Is it correct? Well, I don't know. The thing survives in only about 7 copies, and none of them are contemporary with Grosseteste. So I cannot prove that this is datable to 1249, but I would like to conclude really by just pointing out how original this was, and that Grosseteste is bringing science as he understands it, the science of time, the science of the machina mundi, the science of the geometry of how spheres work, together to demystify weather forecasting. Now you can do it with this handy guide, and you do not need to be a prophet. And he even concludes by telling you how to predict extreme weather events. Do you want to know when there will be a deluge? You can find out. Do you want to know when there will be terrible heat and drought? You can find out. And the power is now in your hands.
Concepts such as those of a day, a month, a minute, etc. Grosseteste seeks something more akin to William's total definition, account of what time, that large-scale feature of the universe, is. So I want to say a few things about his understanding of Aristotle's definition first, and then discuss why he thinks it's adequate. And I hope I have time to at least get to his basic theory. There are a lot of intricacies involved in this material, which I won't be able to get to. Although scholars still debate the meaning of Aristotle's definition of time as a number of change with respect to before and after, Grosseteste thinks the basic idea, and perhaps not the details, is one we are all well aware of. Aristotle arrives at his definition by noting the relation of time to change, and this is in the first part of this, which it's all in your fingers. Okay, it's in these first 2 paragraphs he explains this. As Grosseteste explains, Aristotle, time and change are conceptually inseparable. The thought of one is accompanied by the thought of the other. Such properties of change as divisibility, continuity, and before and after derive, Aristotle claims, from the space over which the change occurs, and time in turn derives these properties from change. Thus, Aristotle concludes that there must be an oblique reference to change in the definition of time. Time is something of change, aliquid motus. From such considerations, Aristotle arrives at his definition of time as a number of change in respect of before and after. But does Aristotle even demonstrate, in this technical sense of providing a proof meeting very strict conditions, a definition of time? Grosseteste thinks not. Instead, he takes Aristotle simply to give an account of what the word time ordinarily means, or perhaps better, of one of the things the word ordinarily means. And Aristotle unfolds the meaning of this word in what Grosseteste calls a levis confabulatio, an informal conversational manner. After all, Grosseteste writes, all those who hear this name time but they've got to. Oh, that's it. You have to see. I was thinking you have to push this way to get it. But it's backwards. Okay, it's backwards. It's a Windows computer. That's the problem. After all, Grosseteste writes, I quote, "All those who hear this name time understand at once that what's named by time, whatever it may be, is indeed a measure of change in respect of before and after." Moreover, Grosseteste points out, Augustine, while well aware that time is a measure of change, still looked for its essence. He didn't know the essence of time, Grosseteste writes, and yet he knew that time, whatever it may be, is related to change as a measure to what is measured by it. That Aristotle is not concerned to provide an account of the essential nature of time is no surprise. Grosseteste thinks the physics is essentially concerned with the study of change, so it's perfectly natural for Aristotle to focus on time's relation to change, and in particular on time in the sense in which it's a measure of change. Thus, later in the text, and I'm not trying to find it, well, I'm completely lost, Grosseteste remarks, "It is perhaps not the concern of the student of nature to determine about time in respect of its essential definition, but only in respect of its relations to change and changeable things." But why, we may ask, isn't the essential nature of time to be a measure of change? To answer this question, let's consider in a little more detail Grosseteste's understanding of Aristotle's definition. Certainly Aristotle considers time to be a measure of change, but it is a measure of a special kind, a number. To explain the sort of measure described as a number, Grosseteste turns to the measurement of bodies, since he sees a strict parallel between the numerical measurement of bodies and the numerical measurement of change. He writes, here we go, it's that passage there. He writes, "Time is called a number of change in the way rational lines and rational magnitudes are called numbers of the bodies that the magnitudes measure in respect of numbered and posited measures. Thus, a 1 cubit or 2 cubit long line is called a number that is numbered and measured out in respect of a posited measure of a line. In this way, change is numbered and measured in respect of measures posited in time." This concept of a rational line or magnitude is drawn from Book 10 of Euclid's Elements, and in one of the manuscripts of the physics commentary, it's explained thus in a passage attributed to Boethius's now lost geometry. The line goes, "A rational line is a line characterized in terms of some number in respect of one of the named measures, namely, for example, in respect of the digit, inch, and palm. In other words, a rational line is a line as it's characterized in terms of n units, where n is some number greater than or equal to 1. Leaving aside questions of fractional characterizations here. And the unit is a conventionally established or positive unit of length. So, for example, a 2 cubit long line is a rational line. It's a line characterized in terms of 2 unit measures of a cubit. And thus it is a number in the sense at issue. This is what is meant by a number in this material, and it may be used to measure bodies. Grosseteste notes, however, a need for care here. Although we ordinarily talk of measuring bodies and of doing so by means of bodies, for example, I measure a piece of wood using by means of a wooden ruler, in actual fact we measure the magnitudes of bodies, and we do so by means of magnitudes conventionally established as units of measurement. We take a body and specify its magnitude as a unit of measure. The cubit is from here to here, right? Take that magnitude is a cubit, and then we can measure the magnitude of other bodies in terms of it. 1, okay, 2 cubits long to here. That's the idea. But what I'm measuring is not the wood, it's the size or magnitude of the wood. Thus, we measure the magnitude of a piece of wood by means of the magnitude of the wooden ruler. Grosseteste applies this account directly to Aristotle's account of time. An n cubits long line is a number of a body in the sense that it's a linear magnitude characterized in terms of n units of a conventionally established unit of length, the cubit. In the same way, time is a number of change in the sense that it's the magnitude of change in respect of before and after as characterized in terms of n units of a conventionally established unit of such magnitude, for example, a day or a minute. This magnitude of change is what we would now call its duration. Thus, time for Aristotle where are we? I've lost my place. Hang on. Thus, time for Aristotle is the numerically characterized magnitude or duration of change. And in fact, a little later in the text, Grosseteste makes a slight modification, holds that he means that time is not the numerically characterized, necessarily the characterizable magnitude of change, for otherwise we will have to say time exists only when duration is actually numerically characterized by the mind, which in fact was a view that Averroes was to adopt, but in work that Grosseteste at this point I think does not know of. I'm not sure, it might not have been written at this point. I don't remember. So we're now in a position to consider why he finds this account unsatisfactory as an account of the true essence of time. I think there are actually a number of reasons for his dissatisfaction, but I want to focus here on two that assume particular importance in accounts of time. So, shortcomings of Aristotle's account. Aristotle's definition of time as the numerically characterizable duration of change would probably be more accurate to describe it as not talking about time as such, but of a period of time, a definition of what a period of time is, what a day, what 2 days, what this kind of talk is about, and what he's capturing in effect, Aristotle, what in his abstract terms, the partial metrical conception of time mentioned by Cicero. He's telling us what a time is, in the sense of what sort of thing is a day or a week or a minute. So understood, his concern is not the one you're likely to have if you ask Augustine's famous question, what is time? In asking this, we're not normally asking, what sort of thing is a day or a week? We're instead asking about the nature of a certain large-scale feature of our experience and the universe. Now, time, as we experience it, seems to have two peculiar features. In the first place, it seems to flow, with the future becoming present, the present becoming past, and the past becoming ever more past. But nothing in Aristotle's account speaks to this idea. As Norman Kretzmann remarked, Aristotle presents his own definition of time in terms of temporal statics as the measurable dimension of motion in respect of earlier and later. Secondly, the present seems to differ in its ontological status from the past and future. The present seems to be real, whereas the past and future seem to be two kinds of unreality. Again, nothing in Aristotle's account of time speaks to this apparent feature of time. Moreover, these two apparent features of time appear to be intimately connected. The flow of time, it might be thought, consists in the fact that the existing present falls continuously into non-existent, and the non-existent future comes into existence. This, at least, is how time appears to us. Now, of course, appearance may not correspond to reality. The majority of contemporary philosophers of time take these apparent features of time to be an illusion, artifacts of the way we experience time and events given our psychology and location in the time series, but not themselves objective features of reality at all. According to these philosophers, the past and future are no less real than the present, and there is no such thing as objective time flow. The majority of medieval thinkers, in contrast, take the flow of time and the unreality of the past and future to be objective features of reality. Now, I think Grosseteste too holds this view. And so an account of the true essence of time must find a place for the flow of time and for the ontological difference between the present on the one hand and the past and future on the other. And these, I suggest, are two reasons, key reasons, why Grosseteste thinks that Aristotle does not propose an account of the true essence of time. Aristotle's account, being concerned with the purely metrical notion of a period of time as a numerical measure of change, simply does not touch on these fundamental features of time. His account seemed perfectly compatible with rejection of temporal flow and acceptance of the reality of the past and future. It doesn't capture what's special about time, since it focuses on what time has in common with measures of spatial magnitude, not on what differentiates time from space. Now, it's notoriously hard to explain the flow of time as an objective feature of reality, and there are proponents of objective time flow amongst philosophers, although they're the minority, and many think that this is, or something related to it, has to be a primitive concept that cannot be fully explicated as sui generis, as it were. And it's noteworthy that Grosseteste himself, when he considers the essential nature of time, does not claim to provide a definition of time or to fully account for its true essence. Instead, he speaks of, I quote, touching on more closely the essence of time. Even so, we can, he thinks, throw some light on time's essence. The key is to see how time is related to eternity. In explicating time in terms of eternity, I propose, Grosseteste hopes to capture, however inadequately, the flow of time and the special nature of the present as the totality of temporal reality. So let's just move this to where we get the key passages. Here we are. Now, there was, of course, precedent for thinking of time and eternity. They're an intimate relation. In the Timaeus, one of the very few works of Plato available to the Latin West, Plato defines time as the moving image of eternity, and this Platonic conception is echoed in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, in the poem Qui Perpetua, where Boethius writes in one line of the poem, O you God who governs the world by everlasting reason, creator of lands and sky, who commands time to go from the Iwum. Now this term Iwum is later employed by medieval authors to refer to the special mode of being of angels, intermediate between God's timeless eternity and time, but in Boethius it's used here to refer to God's timeless eternity. Later in the Consolation, Boethius repeats the Platonic conception of time, writing of how the infinite movement of temporal things imitates the presence of God's motionless life, and of how the motionless presence of eternity bestows on what it touches the appearance of being. At root, this Platonic conception of time is a conception of the nature of temporal existence, and Grosseteste proposes what I think is essentially a version of this line of thought, though somewhat more developed than we find in either Plato or Boethius. And I want to just present the basic picture now, and I will finish after doing that and reserve all the difficulties it raises for some other time. So he begins his account of time by quoting Boethius' famous definition of eternity in Book 5 of the Consolation of Philosophy as the complete possession of life, of the whole of life at once. And he goes on to write, okay, I keep hitting the wrong thing. This at once, Seymour, doesn't refer to an at once in time or in an instant, because it is before an instant and before time. And he writes, I place an at once of this sort above the totality of existence, and as this at once is placed over the totality of uncreated existence, it is first eternity, by which he means God's eternity, while placed over the totality of created existence, it is second eternity, the sort of eternity the angelic substances have. For they are eternal inasmuch as they adhere to the first uncreated existence itself, and through adherence to it, partake in the totality of their existence of the at once of the uncreated existence itself to which they adhere. So according to Grosseteste, Boethius's definition of eternity applies to timeless beings, beings that have the whole of their existence at once, and these beings have no temporal spread to their existence. There is no before and after, temporal before and after in their existence. What distinguishes God's eternity, first eternity, from second eternity, the angel's eternity, is that what exists in second eternity has this relation of adhering to God and of partaking in doing so in the totality of its existence of this at once or simul of God. So the idea is that the angel is in a relationship where its whole existence stands in this relationship of adhering to the at once of God's eternity. And in this respect, an angel is very different from a temporal being, and it's this difference that is key to Grosseteste's account of time. A temporal being partakes of the at once of eternity, but only ever does so in respect of part of its existence, never the whole. Thus, Grosseteste explains time in terms of the totality of existence in general as being deprived of the at once of eternity. That is this last part of this passage. Keep going into the menu for some reason. Keep messing this up. So he writes, the privation, however, of this same at once from the totality of existence in general is time. For existence of which no part has this at once with another is temporal existence. And if some existence alone should be posited and the at once should be divided from its totality, with everything else removed, time must be understood. If you remove this alone, time is destroyed. Hence, this is time. So the idea here is that temporal items don't participate in God's eternity in respect of the whole of their existence, but only ever in respect of a part of it. And it will turn out to be an instantaneous part. Grosseteste believes you can have, unlike Aristotle, you can have instantaneous parts. We won't go into that here. So when one part of a temporal being's existence appears to be at once of eternity, the other parts don't. So this is why he says that time is the privation of the at once of eternity, the totality of existence in general. That is the idea that there are beings whose existence only adheres to the at once of eternity in respect of a part. Now, later in this paper, which I won't get to, I think he's thinking of successive items, items that exist in successive stages, like events and changes. And the idea is if you have a change, you never have the whole of the change in existence. You just have that part that's adhering to eternity. And that's the crucial thing that gives us time. If only angels existed in God, you would not have time, because their existence, the whole of it, precisely because it doesn't have any kind of spread, adheres to the at once of eternity. So in effect, he comes back here to the Aristotelian conception that time and change are together, but that's the conclusion, as it were, of the explanation in terms of eternity. Now, I think I have time to just go for a little more of this theory, and if you give me time, can I take 5 more minutes?
You can indeed. Yes, just
Okay. Just to say a little more about this theory, and we can discuss some of the issues it raises later if people are interested. Grosseteste proceeds to reject the suggestion that we understand the essence of time in terms of what he calls the positive differences that accompany this privation, rather than in terms of the privation. And what he means by this is we shouldn't understand the essential nature of time by starting with the notions of past, present, and future. Instead, we should understand these notions in terms of the notions of adherence of existence, or the lack thereof, to the at once of eternity. Now, when he explains these notions, he makes a confusion, which is quite common in ancient authors, between the concepts of before and after and the concepts of past and future. They're not the same thing, as McTaggart showed, but it's quite common for authors to confuse these. And I'm just going to go on to his little definition, and this is a little further down. You find the passage says, I think, therefore, there it is. So he says, I think, therefore, before and after in time in respect of their true essence are said in terms of a link to the present instant, and this instant is being the adherence of some existence to the, with the at once of eternity, from the totality of which existence the at once of eternity is divided. That is called before, over whose adherence with the at once of eternity falls the relation of anteriority in respect of the presential adherence with the once of eternity. That is to say, helpfully, the before is what has passed through adherence with the at once of eternity, and the future, notice how he's confusing these concepts, is what will pass through adherence. Okay, so the idea is what we mean by past is something that did adhere but doesn't anymore, and what is future is something that will adhere, and the present is what does adhere. Now, obviously, a couple of things to note. First, he seems to take the present to be instantaneous, and I think he subscribes to the view that past and future have no reality at all. Therefore, all there is in existence is an instant of the temporal reality, is the present instant and its contents. The other thing to note is the definition circular, right? Has, will, is, present tense, adhering to the once of eternity. But Grosseteste realizes this, and he notes a little further down. He writes, nor let anyone object that I'm making known these different features of time, as it were, in terms of themselves, for it doesn't come to mind, or it does not easily come to mind, how else they could be known. So the student of nature makes them all known in terms of linked with change and changeable things. Someone knowing their true essence does so by links to the at once of eternity. Now, I just want to briefly say something about how this relates to time flow, and because I'm running out of time, I'm just going to talk through this and not read my paper. So far, we've not mentioned the flow of time in this account, but it's clear that Grosseteste wants this picture to be viewed dynamically. He talks later in the text of the adherences. I think it's in one of the passages.
It's the end of that passage.
Yeah, it's in this somewhere here. Plural of flowing being with the at once of eternity. So he's got this picture that what counts as adhering to the at once of eternity is continuous change. That is the flow of time. This picture is meant to give you a model of the flow of time in terms, and that of course is in Plato's definition, the moving image. This is how he's glossing this out. As for past and future's reality, things are a little less clear on that in the text. Because one way you could read this picture is that the now, you could have this sort of picture of the now of eternity is like a projection beam, a film projector, right? And reality is the film being pulled through it, and when the frame gets the beam on it, it gets the special feature of being present. But notice that on that picture, the past and future frames are real, they're just not in the spotlight. So that's a view where you would have an objective now, flow of time, but also the reality of past and future. And that's the picture I don't think we should have. And here's the reason why, and this is speculative, but Grosseteste has a theory of the nature of existence. Grosseteste's theory of the nature of existence is to say that a creature exists is simply what that means is the creature depends on God. So it's a reductive account. Existence isn't some feature of a creature, it is the fact that the creature depends on God. And my hypothesis is that Grosseteste, the relation of adherence to the at once of eternity is essentially this relation of dependence. And what follows from that is that we can't make sense on the Grossetestean theory of the past and future having any kind of existence, because existence is to be in the spotlight, to adhere, and by definition they don't. And so I believe that he is also committed, and this picture is meant to give us the picture, that all that is real is the present and its content,